if you remember, we're kind of in the middle of a story, and I want us to understand where we are. Okay? So, and especially because the next few weeks are going to be surrounding this one very important event that happens in Acts chapter 7. And this one particular event is actually just the defensive side of the trial of Stephen. So if you remember when we left off, Stephen was being accused, and he had to stand trial in front of the Sanhedrin for the charges against him were blasphemy against Moses and blasphemy against God. And if you remember, they also produced false witnesses to come against Stephen, presumably because they wanted to deflate this movement, right? They wanted to stop the early church in its path. We read last time, one of the big things that they were really up against was the fact that Jesus resurrected, because it was essentially led by Sadducees, and Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And so they were like, no, absolutely not. And they were very insistent that so insistent that they were producing false witnesses and trying to do whatever it was for them to end this teaching. And as I said last time, this group knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what the likely consequences were going to be for this particular crime. They did not care about what happened to Stephen. All they cared about was that they got their way, and that their way was enforced, and that way was going to be the prime way. And this is exactly what happens when people become possessed by some sort of ideology. Right? We see it all the time. No matter, and it happens to people with all kinds of different ideas. But then the idea begins to wield you instead of you wielding the idea. And this can be a real problem. Right? And that's what we're seeing here. At all consequences, right? They're not proving that they're right through the truth. They're proving themselves right by producing false witnesses, by lying and getting up there and having that false testimony. They're going against their own values and their own beliefs just to make a point. And if you find yourself working against what you believe, if you find yourself saying, it's okay for me to lie this one time, then trust me, you're in the wrong. If you find yourself believing in Jesus Christ and you believe that God says that we shouldn't lie, and then you find yourself having to lie in order to enforce a point, then maybe you're doing it wrong. This is a trial, however, so Stephen was afforded his own defense after the accusers made their case and produced their false evidence. And of course, it needed to be false evidence because we know that Stephen actually respected both the law of Moses and he revered God. And this is how it begins in chapter 7, starting in verse 1. We're only going to read the first 8 verses. It says, "The high priest asked Stephen, 'Are these charges true?' To this he replied, 'Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people,' God said, 'and go to the land I will show you.' So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. And after the death of his father, God sent him to the land where you are now living. He gave him no inheritance here, not even the ground to set his foot on. But God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at the time Abraham had no child. God spoke to him in this way, 'For 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves.' And God said, 'And afterward they will come out of that country and worship me in this place.' Then he gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision, and Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him 8 days after his birth. Later Isaac became the father of Jacob. Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs." So a couple of clarifying things before we really get into the meat of the message here today. I wanted to just make some clarifying remarks, just in case people are wondering, because sometimes maybe you just read it and you don't even ask yourself, what does that mean? I know I've done that before. I just go, oh, okay, that'll clear itself up, but it doesn't always. And maybe you've wondered to yourself, who are the Chaldeans? Let me answer that for you. They are the original ancient Semitic people from whom Abraham was a member. This is why today the Jews are known as the Semitic people. They come from ancient Mesopotamia, which is now considered kind of Turkey, Iraq area up in that northern section. Well, I guess north of Israel. It's not really north. And secondly, the city that's identified in this passage, Haran, the wonderful thing about this is that we actually know exactly where the city is today. It's a ruin now, but when Abraham was around, it was quite a large and very powerful city. It was very impressive, and it would have been a center for culture and stuff like that. We know exactly where it is. And what's crazy, I had to share this with my friends this week because I was looking on a map at the ruins of Haran on Google Maps, and what I didn't know is that today, where it is in modern day, is in Turkey. Just north of it is the city of Batman. Not even kidding. Go look it up. Batman, Turkey. It's a real place. It's crazy. But anyway. So now back to the trial. And this is the first time that we actually get to see what's going on from Stephen's eyes. Right? Up until this point, if you've been with us a month ago when we were talking about this, we only got to see what was being said by the accusers, and we only got to see the false narrative that they were trying to produce. So this is the first time we actually get to hear from Stephen. And we finally get to kind of hear his side of things and how things unfolded. And the first thing I want to point out is before we even get very far at all, is how he regards those that are sitting in judgment over him. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to court. Many people have for many different reasons, for all kinds of different things. Maybe you've watched courtroom dramas, who knows. But just because you should have respect for the judge sitting in front of you doesn't mean that that's what happens, right? Many people have all kinds of different feelings and emotions and reactions to the people sitting in judgment over them, especially when it's someone whom they disagree with vehemently, right? When they have no regard. Have you ever seen people who make, I've seen this so many times, maybe because I'm just a sucker for that courtroom stuff, but people who claim like the sovereign citizen thing, and they'll say, no, I'm a sovereign citizen, I don't adhere to your laws, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess how well that flies, and guess how much respect they end up showing the judge, right? Like, they're not very respectful, and guess what? It doesn't end up mattering because you are being held accountable to the law. I say all this to say, if we are witnessing the trial of someone who is truly rebellious, coming out against God, against the temple, against the people of Moses, right, against the law itself, I would expect a little bit more rebellion than what we're seeing. But that's not what we see. He regards those that are sitting in judgment over him as his brothers and fathers. Now, most of us might skip right over this particular little detail, but and it may not even be that surprising to you, because given their culture and given that all the early Christians at this point are still Jewish, there probably literally was some brothers and fathers on that particular council that was sitting in judgment over him. But the reason I find this significant is because of what he's being charged with: blasphemy against Moses and blasphemy against God. For someone who holds such views, you would expect them to be maybe a little bit more rebellious, certainly to be in a lot more conflict with their people, and not hold them in such high regard, not hold them in such esteem still. Why would you still call them brothers and sisters? And I think that says a lot about their attitude. For example, there are a lot of different Christian denominations. And as far as I see it, right, as long as you believe that Jesus rose from the dead and he is resurrected, and you believe that he is the forgiveness of sins and it's only by his grace, then I call you brother and sister. Right? You don't have to come to this church. You don't have to be part of the PAOC. As long as you believe that thing, then I can say, hey, you and I, we have this thing in common. We have this connection. You are my brother. You're my sister. Right? The commonality, it's the link, the relationship that brings them together. But there's a lot of false Christian groups as well. Right? They put up the facade of Christian, but they are not our brothers and sisters. They pretend to be, and yet they accept false teaching. They accept a false Bible in many cases. Or in many cases, they reject the Bible altogether. They reject the Word of God. I think this is very important for us to understand about Stephen, because of the way that these words are used. For starters, I want to get into it that we know the charges are bogus, but we also have to remember that in this day and age, right, in 2,000 years ago, to call someone your father was more than just a sound you made with your mouth in order to group people into different categories so that we can understand family relationships. Right? To call someone father meant something. And I was thinking about this as I was preparing this morning. I thought, it all started to go downhill when people started saying, oh, don't call me Mr. So-and-so, that's my father. And it's like, no, we should have kept that up because we kind of lost the idea of respecting our elders, of honoring those that came before us, listening to their wisdom. And instead now it's just become a word we make with our mouths. Right? We just try and sort people into categories, but we don't actually have the same kind of cultural meaning and impact that it had. Right? This was written at a time where names and titles had meaning. Right? Names had meaning. You didn't have to remind children to respect their father because the entire culture was a culture that respected fathers, who respected those who came before them, who respected their wisdom and what they had. Father was more than just an identifier to tell me where I got half of my chromosomes. Instead, it was a sign of respect, of wisdom, and of honor. It's with this that we can tell he still has respect for the Sanhedrin. And we know this because we see many instances where they don't speak in the same manner. He also calls them brother. And I mentioned this before. This is an identifying connection with people. It's not a distinction like we're led to believe. If he really did see himself as someone who was against the law of Moses, who was against God himself, why would he want to identify himself with these people? He's showing them, even in this simple address, he does not find himself separate or removed from the family of Abraham. And of course, this is something that Paul will clarify for the Gentiles later on. But since I'm nitpicking, I think it's important for me also to point out how Stephen regards God himself. He calls God the God of glory. And he also mentions the appearance of Abraham, God's appearance to Abraham. And if this man who had no regard for the law of Moses or holy God, or if this was a man, who had no regard for the law of Moses or for a holy God, then so far he's not showing it to us. He goes on and he appeals to the narrative that remains a strong part of both Christian and Jewish tradition to this day. The call of Abraham and the promised land for his descendants to live. It's one that we all know very well if you've been part of the church for any length of time. If you've ever read the book of Genesis, you will know it. If you're a Christian who's read your Bible, then this isn't just the original promise, but it's the promise that is still alive and valid to this day. The beauty of God and God's promises is that God doesn't change. God remains the same. He's steadfast. He's true. When he makes a deal, that deal is good. He holds true to his word. And we can trust his promise, even if it is not one that we will still see fulfilled in our lifetime. It is something that we know to be true. See, this is the key, and it's paramount to our faith. Right? Think about it. If God was in the business of just changing his word, especially if we failed on our end, then let me tell you, we wouldn't be living under grace, and we'd be in a great deal more trouble. He also calls Abraham to do something. He calls him to do something big, something challenging, something so extraordinary that almost every one of us here would certainly be unable to achieve it. He calls Abraham to leave his people. In a world right now with an identity crisis, this seems nearly impossible. People are constantly trying to figure out where they belong in the world, trying to make it all make sense. And it seems silly to me. Why? Because the world seems to think it can do just fine without God. But every single time they've made this effort to remove God from the culture, to remove God from their world, from the way that they do things, it always ends the same, in utter failure and ruin. Every single time. So why are people in such a panic? Why is it today, 2024, why is this big question still around the purpose of life? Why is it always this idea of the meaning? Why are we here? What was I put here for? Didn't God answer that for us already so long ago? Haven't we known the answer to life? If you're a Christian, you certainly should. And isn't this exactly what Stephen is laying out for us right here? God created the world. Why? So we would have a place to live. And why did he create us? Because he wanted to share his glory with us. He wanted us to live together. He wanted us to live in relationship with him. And relationship is key. It's essential. Right? Not trying to find meaning within ourselves. Not trying to find our purpose buried deep down inside, where if I just look long enough and hard enough, eventually I will find something that will bring me meaning and virtue. No. It's about our relationships with each other. And through our relationships with each other, we suddenly see our purpose revealed. Fellowship. And fellowship with God Most High. See, the problem is we turned our back on this relationship a long time ago, back in the days of Adam. But when God called Abram, he did so because he wanted to restore that relationship. It was the beginning of a process that led to Jesus, dying on the cross and led to a time of grace. He wanted to make a way through people, a people blessed by God, for the simple reason that he promised he would do so. So when God sent Abraham left. He left everything that he knew behind, and he wanted to forge a new path, a path that God laid before him. And Stephen wants us to remember as well who it is that makes up the family of God. And it's those of us who are ready to make that kind of sacrifice as well. I've talked about this many times. Following Jesus isn't just showing up to church, singing a few songs, saying a couple prayers and going. It's about sacrifice. If it didn't cost you anything, if it didn't mean you had to give something up, then maybe you need to examine inside yourself and ask, wait, have I held on to things that maybe I should have gotten rid of? Because I highly doubt that any one of us here has led that perfect life. This, of course, leads to the next leg of the story, the waiting. Right, so we've had the faith, we've had the sacrifice, and now we have the wait. And not only was Abraham promised some great promise, right? He was told his descendants would number the sand on the sea, the stars in the sky. There would be millions of his children. But he was also told that it would not be he. It would be the future generations that would prosper. And this, I think, is very difficult for people in the year 2024. Right? We want to live in the moment, live in the now. We want to get the most out of life while we're here and do this now. But that wasn't what Abraham was called to. Abraham was called to make a sacrifice, not so that he could prosper, but so that his future generations down the line would prosper. Not even so his son would prosper, not even so that Jacob would prosper. But for 400 years later, for that generation to prosper. To trust in God is to trust in the long term. Beyond yourself, beyond your kin. And Abram was asked to make the wait. And the reason that to appeal to this story is for Abram's faith. Right, I've brought this up before, and I'm too bad Seth's not here. I always ask him, Seth, what is a synonym for faith? It's trust. Where do you have your trust? He had to wait many years until the promised heir was born. Remember, it said right at the beginning, he had no heir. He had no son. He was getting up in age. He still didn't have any kids. There was no one to inherit from, no one to carry on the line, no one to become a great nation. And then when God called him and called him into this journey that he began, the son wasn't born right away. He had to wait and wait and wait. But he kept faith. It was simply faith that guided him from his homeland to the promised land. And of course, faith is not a foreign concept to the Jews. God didn't leave Abram with nothing, however. This is important. He gave him a sign, a mark to bear, that both he and his descendants would bear, and it would be a sign of the covenant sworn between God and Abraham all those years ago. See, Abram bore the sign of circumcision, and it was a constant reminder of the promise of God, that they were set apart. It is a vow that the Jews of the day took seriously, and until this day, they still take seriously. And then this leg of the journey ends with the promised child being delivered after many, many years of wandering, going all through the land of Canaan. A lot of faith and sacrifice, and finally the first fruits of the promise arrive. And this is important for the elders in the Sanhedrin to remember, but I think it's even more so important for us to remember today. See, this part of the story about Abraham, the waiting, the faith, the sacrifice, each one of these components is an important journey that each and every one of us needs to be ready to embark on. Are you ready to embark in faith? Are you ready to give up that which Jesus asks us to sacrifice? And are you willing to be patient? Stephen is reminding them and us that God made a promise that he will deliver on. He's going to get into it later on in the chapter, but the promised child was born. And that was Jesus Christ. The promised land is before them, and the mission has never changed. Right? Whether it was the people of the Jewish people, Abraham's descendants, whether it was them or whether it is us today, the point is the mission has never changed. It is to draw people in to worship the one true God. Right? Jesus described them as the light on the hill, a beacon that drew people into safety from troubled waters. You may not see the promise come into full fruition in your lifetime, but every step forward and through every generation is another step closer. Every sacrifice you make today, every ounce of faith spent is not for nothing. All will bring glory to God, and we just need to have the patience and humility to see it happen. I'm reminded of the story, and we were talking about this as a board a little while ago, and you guys could probably find it on YouTube, or it's out there anyway. It's the story called The Man from George Street, and it's a true story. I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard this before, but he's from Sydney, Australia, and he lived on George Street. They were at this conference, this pastor's conference, and bunch of different people were talking about their stories about how they came to be saved, and the first person gets up and they're telling their story, and they're saying, yeah, I was walking down George Street in Sydney, and suddenly a man just appeared out of nowhere, and he said, if you were to die today, do you know what would happen to you? And then he handed me a tract, and that he went on his way. And he found that quite strange, but he ended up reading it, and he started to feel really convicted, and then he realized, you know what, like all this time I've been pretending that I was something that I'm not, and so he became a believer, and then eventually led him down a path where he became a preacher. And there was yet another man who was a deacon. He was a deacon at a church, and he was walking down the street and saw this man on George Street, and the man said, well, if you were to die today, do you know what would happen to your soul? And the guy felt really offended, and he said, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? How, like, I am a deacon, I'm an upstanding member of my church and all of this. And then what he ended up realizing was he had never really considered the condition of his soul and whether or not he was actually in good relationship with God. And what he realized in that moment was, wait a minute, after some reflection, he started to realize, wait a minute, things aren't good between me and God, and he was able to make them right. And then he was able to be led into this prosperous relationship with God. And there was just story after story, and they were like, man, like we have to find this man. And so they eventually went and found him. They found this man. And they said, like, and they were trying to tell him, like, This is the impact that you've had on so many people. And it just brought tears to his eyes because he's like, I've been doing this for 25 years. He said, my wife, I'm pretty sure she was diagnosed with cancer. And he said, if you save her, every single day for the rest of my life, I will tell somebody about you. And so for 25 years, this man was going out and he was just telling people about Jesus, handing them tracts. That's all he was doing. And he had no idea what kind of impact he was making for the kingdom. He had no idea, but he was willing to give up that time. He was willing to put his faith in God and say, God, if you're going to do this thing for me, then I need to live for you. We don't always get to see the impact. And Stephen started with the call of Abram because that is the beginning of the story for the children of Abraham. He wants them to remember that there is a cost. And they also wants them to remember what it is that God has done for them. He has led them through so much. He has brought them through trial again and again and again. That the promise that was made is a promise that will be kept. And that promise still persists to this day. So will you trust in the promise of God? Will you, as Paul said, be grafted in and join the family of Abraham, be the adopted children, if you like? See, the beauty is Jews are the children of promise because they were born that way, but we become the children of promise by accepting the grace of Jesus Christ. Are you right with God? Have you accepted that grace? Or are you still trying to do it on your own? As we go to a time of prayer, I just want us to keep that in consideration. Will you join me in a life of faith leading to grace, or are you going to try and struggle and do it on your own?